One sister received the crown, and the other spent her life trying to breathe outside its shadow. Queen Elizabeth II became the face of duty restraint and national survival. Princess Margaret became the face of glamour, rebellion, heartbreak, and royal scandal. Elizabeth was quiet, orderly, and serious. Margaret was vivid, witty, mischievous, and impossible to ignore. Elizabeth was born in Mayfair, London on the 21st of April, 1926. 4 years later, Margaret was born in Scotland during a storm. Their parents were Albert, Duke of York, known as Bertie, and Elizabeth, Duchess of York. At the time, no one expected these girls to stand at the center of royal history. Their father was the second son of King George V. The next king was supposed to be their uncle, Prince David, later Edward VIII. Elizabeth and Margaret were expected to live close to the throne, but not on it. From childhood, the sisters were different. Elizabeth loved dogs, horses, order, and routine. She was naturally tidy and careful. Margaret was bright, funny, cheeky, and fearless. Their father adored them both, but in different ways. Elizabeth was his pride. Margaret was his joy. Elizabeth seemed built for responsibility. Margaret seemed built for delight. Then came 1936, the year that destroyed the quiet future planned for them. On January 20th, 1936, King George V died at Sandringham. Prince David became King Edward VIII, but the new king carried a crisis. He was in love with Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had already been divorced and was still part of a world the British establishment viewed with suspicion. To Edward, Wallis represented freedom and glamour. To the royal family, the government, and the Church of England, she represented danger. The monarch was also supreme governor of the Church of England, and in that age, the idea of a king marrying a divorced woman with former husbands still living was considered impossible. Behind closed doors, ministers and courtiers understood that the king had to choose. He could keep the crown, or he could keep Wallis Simpson. He chose Wallis. On the 11th of December 1936, Edward VIII abdicated after less than a year as king. The abdication changed Elizabeth forever. Her father, Bertie, became King George VI, a role for which he had not been fully prepared. On the 12th of May 1937, he was crowned at Westminster Abbey. He chose the name George to project stability after the shock of Edward's departure. Elizabeth became heir to the throne. From 1938, Elizabeth received private tuition from Sir Henry Martin, Vice Provost of Eton College. She studied constitutional history, monarchy, and the working habits of a sovereign. Her father explained the official dispatch boxes that would become part of her daily burden. Margaret was not given the same preparation. Her education focused on music, singing piano, French conversation manners, and social polish. Elizabeth was being shaped into a monarch. Margaret was being shaped into an accomplished royal woman expected to marry well. The balance between them changed. Elizabeth moved closer to duty. Margaret moved closer to freedom and frustration. Then the Second World War placed both sisters inside a national drama. When Nazi Germany threatened Europe, some suggested that the princesses should be sent overseas for safety. The royal family refused. They needed to show that they would not abandon Britain while ordinary people faced bombs, blackouts, and fear. The king stayed. The queen stayed. Elizabeth and Margaret stayed. The sisters were moved to Windsor Castle. Margaret later said they were supposed to go for 5 days and stayed for 5 years. Blackout curtains covered Windsor, and explosions in London could sometimes be felt through its walls. But the image of the royal family remaining in Britain became powerful wartime symbolism. As the war continued, Elizabeth grew into public responsibility. In 1944, after turning 18, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service. She learned to drive repair engines and work as a mechanic. The sight of the young princess in overalls mattered. It told the public that the future queen was not standing apart from the national struggle. The war also brought Elizabeth closer to the man she had chosen. In July 1939, when she was 13, she visited the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth and met Prince Philip. He was young, handsome, confident, and glamorous. Elizabeth noticed him immediately. 3 years later, when Philip was on leave from the Navy, they spent Christmas in the same circle and began exchanging letters. Her parents wondered whether this was only a childhood crush. Elizabeth did not let go. On November 20th, 1947, Elizabeth and Philip married at Westminster Abbey. Margaret was among the bridesmaids. Nearly 3,000 guests watched. Britain was still living with rationing, but the wedding gave the country a flash of color after years of hardship. On the 14th of November 1948, Elizabeth gave birth to Prince Charles. 3 more children would follow over the next 16 years. Charles' birth pushed Margaret further away from the line of succession. She never truly wanted to be queen, but she knew the emptiness of being important without being essential. Elizabeth had a husband, children, and a destiny. Margaret had attention, beauty, and status, but no fixed role. In the post-war years, King George VI grew seriously ill. In September 1951, doctors removed his left lung after discovering a malignant tumor. The king was not clearly told that he had cancer. On the morning of the 6th of February 1952, George VI died at the age of 56. Elizabeth was in Kenya when the news reached her. She had left Britain as a princess. She returned as queen. For Elizabeth, grief was immediately swallowed by duty. For Margaret, the loss was devastating in a different way. Their father had adored her. With him gone, she lost the person who had made her feel uniquely loved. Queen Elizabeth II was crowned on June 2nd, 1953 at Westminster Abbey. About 8,000 people filled the Abbey, and millions lined the streets of London. It was the first coronation to be televised. Britain was still marked by post-war austerity. Yet the ceremony promised renewal and a new Elizabethan age. But behind the ceremony, a private crisis was already unfolding. During the preparations for the coronation, Margaret told Elizabeth that she wanted to marry Peter Townsend. Townsend was a decorated Royal Air Force officer and a wartime flying ace. He had flown more than 500 missions and had been shot down twice. King George VI had admired him deeply. Townsend had served inside the royal household and had become close to the family. After the king's death, he remained near Margaret, and in her grief she turned toward him. He was brave, calm, admired by her father and part of the world she had lost. But the romance was explosive. Townsend was 16 years older than Margaret. He was also divorced and had 2 sons. For Margaret, those facts did not end the relationship. For the monarchy, the church, and the government, they created a crisis. The memory of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson was still fresh. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, members of the royal family needed the sovereign permission to marry. Elizabeth loved Margaret and wanted her to be happy, but she was also the new queen and supreme governor of the Church of England. She was trapped between sisterly love and constitutional duty. Elizabeth asked Margaret to wait until after the coronation. Margaret left the meeting hopeful, but senior advisors were alarmed. Townsend was appointed air attaché in Brussels, a move that separated him from Margaret. He did not even get a proper goodbye. Margaret was on a royal tour in Africa. The separation was meant to cool the romance, but it turned the story into a public drama. Margaret and Townsend continued writing to each other. They believed they only had to wait. The key date was August 1955, when Margaret would turn 25. At that age, a royal family member could petition Parliament for permission to marry. If both houses did not oppose it, she could have a civil marriage. Newspapers counted down and speculated that an engagement was near, but the birthday passed with no announcement. Finally, on 31st October 1955, Princess Margaret released a statement. She would not marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. For years, many believed that Margaret had been crushed by the government, the church, and the monarchy. Later, evidence made the truth more complicated. The government under Anthony Eden had found a way for Margaret to marry Townsend if she truly wanted to do so. She would have lost her place in the line of succession, but not everything. A private letter showed that Margaret needed to see Townsend again before deciding whether to marry him. When the moment came, the love may no longer have been strong enough to survive the cost. Margaret chose not to marry him, but the decision left a wound. In the late 1950s, Elizabeth became a symbol of steadiness in a Britain losing imperial power. The Suez Crisis exposed the country's diminished role in the world and helped bring down Prime Minister Anthony Eden. Elizabeth offered stability. Margaret offered glamour. She opened hospitals, launched ships, attended ceremonies, smoked in public with an elegant cigarette holder, and moved through artistic circles. In 1957, she became president of the new Royal Ballet, reflecting her lifelong love of theatre music and performance. Yet she was approaching 30, still unmarried, and still without a role that fully satisfied her. Then came Anthony Armstrong Jones. He was not the usual royal match. He came from a wealthy and educated background, but he had no grand title and no great landed inheritance. He was a photographer. Margaret met him at a dinner party in February 1958. With him, she found a world that felt modern and private. She visited his rented flat near the Thames, sometimes disguised in a headscarf and dark glasses. From that flat, she could see the River Tower Bridge and St. Paul's Cathedral. At high tide, she said swans would look in. Their relationship was kept secret, so Britain was stunned when the engagement was announced in February 1960. On 6th May 1960, Princess Margaret married Anthony Armstrong Jones at Westminster Abbey. It was the first royal wedding broadcast on television, and millions watched around the world. Margaret was hugely popular. Everything she wore and did made news. For a moment, the marriage seemed modern glamorous and suited to a changing age. But the dream began to crack. Anthony belonged to a restless artistic bohemian circle. Margaret enjoyed that world, but she could not stop being royal. She expected the privileges, rituals, and protections of her rank. He resisted being absorbed into the royal machine. She resisted living like an ordinary wife. Within a few years, the strain was obvious. There were affairs on both sides. Alcohol and drugs deepened the damage. Cruelty entered the marriage. The press, once respectful toward royalty, was changing fast. Tabloids were becoming hungry for scandal and more willing to print it. Margaret became an easy target. Her marriage moods, parties, friends, cigarettes, and mistakes were turned into public entertainment. By Elizabeth's Silver Jubilee in 1977, Britain had changed dramatically. Old class divisions had weakened. Social taboos had faded. The British Empire had become a commonwealth of independent nations. Elizabeth remained the thread holding the monarchy together. Margaret had pushed at the boundaries of royal behavior, but she paid for that freedom with ridicule, loneliness, and a reputation she could never fully control. Her life was privileged, but it was not simple. She had palaces rank beauty, famous friends, theatre, ballet, books, music, and style. But she lacked the one thing Elizabeth had from 1936 onward, a fixed purpose. Elizabeth belonged to the crown. Margaret belonged near the crown, but never fully inside it. She had more freedom than Elizabeth, but less direction. She had more glamour, but less protection. She could rebel, but never escape. Like her father, Margaret was a heavy smoker for much of her life. From the late 1980s, her health began to decline after several severe strokes. On February 9, 2002, Princess Margaret died at the age of 71. For Queen Elizabeth, the loss was immense. The bond between the sisters had survived jealousy, duty, scandal, distance, and difference. Margaret had been difficult, brilliant, wounded, funny, and demanding. But she was also the Queen's sister, the one person who had known Elizabeth before the crown. Became everything. At Margaret's funeral, the Queen showed rare public emotion. 7 weeks later, the Queen Mother also died. Elizabeth had once feared losing both her mother and her sister. In 2002, that fear became reality. Princess Margaret's life remains one of the most revealing stories inside the modern royal family. She was not the sovereign. She did not carry Elizabeth's constitutional burden, but that absence became its own burden. She stretched the limits of what a royal woman could do. She helped make the monarchy look more modern, more stylish, and more exposed to the celebrity age. She created space for younger royals to live closer to normal life. Elizabeth and Margaret were opposites, but together they tell the story of a monarchy forced to survive the 20th century. Margaret belonged to the age of celebrity that was beginning to rise. Elizabeth learned how to lead the monarchy through that age without surrendering its core. One sister was the crown. The other was the spark beside it. Elizabeth carried the duty. Margaret carried the longing. Elizabeth became history. Margaret became the warning of what can happen to someone born close to power, controlled by power, but never given a throne of her own.